Welcome to the Future State, the show where we take important topics from different industries, dissect them, and look at where they're heading in the future. I'm Nick Walter, CEO of Vortic Art, and I've been building technology companies for the last 12 years, as well as consulting and advising startups and blue chips.
I'm Danny Denhard, former crowdfunding marketing and growth exec, currently founder of Focus.business, the company culture and strategy advisory. I'm also a professional coach and mentor, and of course the co-host of the Future State podcast.
Yeah, I forgot that bit. I should have gone with Future State podcast host. There you go. But this week's a really good show. I'm looking forward to it actually because it's a little bit about what I do day in, day out. And this week we're going to dive into the future state of virtual and augmented reality. So topic close to my heart, as I've said there. But here's why it's interesting at the moment, and I thought it was a good time to talk about it. There's a lot of news at the moment around VR and AR. We've seen a bit of a flurry over the past few weeks. I think there's been some really interesting VR specific examples. So a couple of weeks ago, Mark Zuckerberg was talking about Facebook's direction in VR, which all comes through Oculus, the company they acquired, and he was talking about a new Oculus headset. So currently Oculus have started to generate some adoption of VR headsets through their Quest headsets. So there's Quest 1 and Quest 2, and they're wireless, which has really helped the adoption of the headsets. You don't need a big high-powered computer, there's not a load of wires everywhere, and it works well just to kind of put it on your head, off you go, plug and play. You need a little bit of space at home, but not too much. You don't need any sensors, and Quest has done super well. And he's been talking about a new Quest, the Quest Pro, which will be a high-end VR experience, still wireless, but they'll be looking at increasing the quality of the resolution, adding sensors to the device, so face, eye tracking, but also looking at health and fitness and how, you know, your metrics and connected health and fitness devices can interact with the headsets. And on the other side of the, I suppose, the competition coin, because there's really two main front runners in the VR hardware space. The other one is HTC, who have been around just as long. And they have announced a new version. They've actually pre-launched it for release in June, of a new headset called the Vive Focus 3. This is also a wireless headset, but very different to Oculus Quest. It's aimed at the business market, and it's got a price point to match of just over £1,200. The specs that they've actually released, which are really, really interesting to see, especially from an industry perspective, a 5K resolution, 120 degree field of view. So that means the space that you can see through the headset without coming into any kind of side of the headset and being restricted in any way. And also they've made a bit of a push for supporting 3D spatial audio, and that's either via the built-in directional speakers in the headset itself, which basically beam audio into your ears, or adding an actual, audio headset to consume that enhanced sound capability. So they've been two big hardware shifts in the VR space, and also there's been some interesting information on releases in the AR space. So just before Zuckerberg started talking about the Quest Pro in March, Facebook made a promotional video and released information about what Facebook Reality Labs are working on alongside the VR hardware. And it's all to do with augmented reality, glasses, wrist devices, how they work with your body's neural networks, and how your hands, for example, can become controllers of the future for the glasses, and how we can have different interfaces that aren't reliant on a mobile screen or computer screen. It will be via headset, and then you'll be able to actually use gesture control and virtual typing to do things, which is displayed via the AR glasses. So super interesting as well, and is kind of starting to cross between virtual reality and augmented and mixed reality, and we can talk about those terms a little bit more in a second. The other one, which is something that we all might come across a little bit sooner, is Google have launched a beta version of their AR walking directional overlay, so the augmented reality part of Google Maps, which enables you to hold up your phone to the real world, and the camera will be enabled so you can see through the device onto the real world, and it overlays the directional information as you're walking around. So if you're trying to navigate London or a big city, you can hold your phone up, and rather than trying to work it out on the map, it will point you in the right direction based on what you're looking at. So not super intuitive, because you still got to hold your phone up in front of your face and be looking through the phone onto the real world, but it's something that's interesting in the development of augmented reality. But I probably threw a few terms out there: virtual reality, augmented reality, AR, mixed reality. So I'll just quickly make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to the terminology, because some things might be new to some of the people listening. So I'll start at the top with virtual reality, or VR, which is basically the headsets that you put on and you're fully immersed in a virtual environment or virtual reality world, and you can't see out. Once you've got the headset on, that's it, you're inside and you're fully immersed, and it's a very unique experience, and it's great if you haven't tried it. Augmented reality, or AR, is when you use a device like your phone camera and you overlay digital information or graphics on the real world, or something that could be a real world building, it could be a person, whatever. Mixed reality is basically a mixture of the two. So it's a headset that you can actually see the real world through. It's a display-based headset which projects augmented graphics, like augmented reality, onto the display and overlays it on top of a real world environment. So they're the kind of three main terms that are thrown about quite a lot. Another one that's creeping up that you may or may not have come across so far is XR, which is extended reality, which is basically a term that encompasses all of the mediums that we've just mentioned: VR, AR, MR. So XR is the combined term for all of those. And then another one, which I'm sure we'll touch on in the show today, Metaverse, which is the sum of all shared and persistent virtual spaces. It's the totality of all digital and virtual worlds, as well as all digital assets and the data on the entire internet. It's kind of like an always-on space that you can access all the time, and that's the metaverse that you can delve into at any moment. And I'm sure we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But just to make sure, there's probably some things that you might be thinking about, like, I've never tried VR, or I haven't done AR, or whatever. So some quite consumer-based AR applications have been things like Pokemon Go. So obviously there was a big groundswell in Pokemon Go, people chasing Pokemon down the street and trying to catch them via the smartphone on their camera. That was a big one that really kicked off any kind of mass usage of AR. And since then we've had filters on Snapchat. If we're changing our face on Snapchat, sending a snap, that's AR heavy, that's all AR technology. And another one you may have used is IKEA's app, where you can place furniture in a room. These are some of the ones that most people are a bit more likely to have either heard about or used and be more familiar with. But I do appreciate there's a lot, especially in the virtual reality space, that people wouldn't have got into so far. And let's talk about that quickly, just so I can whiz you through VR and where that's currently being used. So there's two distinct splits in virtual reality. One is consumer and one is enterprise. And on the consumer side, that's really the play that Facebook is making with the Oculus headsets. It's about easily accessible content and adoptable content, especially around gaming, and also a low price point. No need for really high-end technology. And the enterprise side, which has become the central focus of HTC, who are the other leader in VR technology, has become something that HTC have been able to monetize on a little bit of a higher price point, a little bit more enterprise-based scale. And they've chosen their lane, and Oculus have chosen their others. And that's not to say that the two can't cross, but they've definitely got distinct positioning there. On the consumer side, the Oculus Quest has been amazing. The Oculus Quest 2, which is the upgraded version that came out more recently, is their latest headset version, has sold really well, and Facebook has seen high levels of adoption that have outperformed what they were expecting. If you were to get yourself an Oculus Quest 2, which I do recommend, $299 I think is the entry point price, and there's a lot of fun to be had It's a good kind of start point with VR, but there's some great games on there, and a lot of it is gaming based. But you've got things like Star Wars. There's about 4 or 5 Star Wars titles now that you can do. You've got first person shooter style games, and you've got a lot of fitness based games where you're getting a workout as part of the game, or it can be a specific fitness application. So there's FitXR, which allows you to do boxing and dancing, and it's all tracking calories burnt, and it's specifically for fitness. And then there's things like Beat Saber, which is just a really good fun game to play, where you basically cut blocks in half with lightsabers to music, and you're doing it to the beat, but obviously you're super active during that, and you're burning a lot of calories and getting out of breath. And what actually Facebook is starting to see is the adoption of more social apps. So these are, you'll have your avatar, you'll be in a multiplayer environment where you can go and meet other people in virtual worlds. And they've started to become some of the top ranking apps on the Oculus Store. And they're also seeing a growth in productivity apps as well. It's something, when you're in the VR experience, it is singular and it is isolating, but in a way that you don't have that level of digital distraction, because you can't actually look at your phone whilst you've got the headset on, and you're not getting the same levels of notifications. So it's going to be interesting to see whether the productivity apps go there. And also location-based experiences are on the rise. Is what we do at Vortic, give the ability to people anywhere in the world to visit art galleries and museums via a VR headset. And obviously we offer things on mobile and web as well if you don't have a VR headset, but it's great to consume that kind of content in a VR headset. But on the enterprise side, that's really where there's been a lot of different use cases coming through, and I think it's really topical right now because it's worked really well with remote working. So for example, there's a lot of businesses using VR to train new staff. There's training simulations, especially for more dangerous professions such as firefighters. There's remote collaboration, so multiplayer work environments where you can meet in a virtual business space that has some level of display, and you can collaborate with colleagues there. Design, therapy and rehabilitation, so there's been lots of work there around. A really good example of this actually was people have been out to Afghanistan and they're suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, and it's the ability for a therapist to work with them with very vivid visualizations that can help rehabilitate them and help them deal with the problems that they're facing. Also education as well, and there's some big people playing in this space that you might not come across unless you're kind of industry specific or into this. So Seat and a lot of other car manufacturers actually, but they use virtual prototyping a lot to build new cars. Seat have reported a 30% reduction in prototype production time thanks to VR, which is amazing. Porsche using AR glasses to overlay information on real vehicle parts, and it gives engineers and technicians easily accessible information as they're doing things. And you're seeing that a lot actually with companies that are going out, for example, like if you're going out to do something on an electricity meter or make a repair on a piece of equipment on a boiler, and you can overlay information that means you don't have to look at the manuals. It's been really well used, the mixed reality technology or augmented reality technology there. And then there's other companies. There's one called Osso VR, who have basically recently expanded their training modules to include specialties such as interventional procedures and endoscopies, as well as orthopedic training. So basically it allows surgeons to train on operations without having to do it on a real person, which is good, and sales teams and other trainees to practice techniques within a safe and repeatable environment that feels real. It feels like you're there, you're in the mix, and it's not something that's going to catch you by surprise. So there's lots of things that it's been used for, and I think that with these crazy predictions about how VR is going to take off, it hasn't really happened in line with a lot of the predictions from maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, but there has been growth. And some of the big barriers that we've come across as an industry is the quality of the headsets. So either the wireless don't have the resolution and computing power to get the quality to make it feel real or feel as accurate as possible, and tethered headsets which are connected to PCs via cables, and they do get better processing power and resolution, but they're limiting because you need a expensive machine, cables, and it doesn't feel great when you're using them, but it looks great. The content as well, and we produce a lot of virtual content, but it's very expensive to produce. It has long production cycles, and what that means in reality is that the games that are produced for virtual reality are quite short, and you can complete, for example, Star Wars on Oculus. You'll pay maybe $18.99, something like that, for that title, and you'll complete it within a couple of hours, which doesn't really seem in line with what people are used to when it comes to gaming. But it's just the way that the production cycles are. Like, there's certain limitations of the headsets, there's a lot of cost that goes into it, and they almost need to make a title, sell it, create more revenue to create the next title. And the other big one's been latency and bandwidth. So existing network connectivity and speed isn't designed to support VR and AR experiences as a kind of newer development. But this is changing with 5G and 6G, and the possibilities that they offer, especially around like truly high network speeds and ultra low latency, mean that the whole experience of VR can be, and AR can be made higher quality, can be delivered at greater speed. You're not going to get any lag or disruptions in the experience. A lot of people are seeing 5G and 6G giving us a lot more, or giving a jump start actually to VR and AR, and more widespread adoption and more things happening. And obviously the headsets go alongside that as well, especially these wireless ones that are Wi-Fi enabled and need to pull a lot of networks rather than on the device itself. So yeah, there's lots of optimism there, but hopefully that's a quick whistle-stop tour for anybody that didn't know much about VR and AR. And maybe, Danny, we'll dive into some discussion points.
I think if we were to stop it there, that's the dummies guide that everyone would need for AR, VR, XR. 12 minutes of waxing lyrical about the pros, the cons. That was £10,000 intro that you'd get from a consultancy. So I think that's a great way to sort of dive into it. I think there's a couple of things that you said that I'd call out, and just to give people some context is, I think VR in general is one of those things that a lot of people haven't had a use for and haven't used it. Therefore, it's difficult for people to understand how good or how bad it might be. So I think some of the gaming examples is really important. There's a company called Sandbox Vr, which started out in the US, which were experience-based. So essentially you would go to a place in San Francisco and then you'd game either individually or as a group. And it was really good because you could dive into and really experience designed games and experiences. It's so immersive that it got huge amounts of money pumped into it. A lot of it's still based around a PC, so you still need a high-value PC and gaming PC to do it. The connection will be, like you said, with 5 and 6G is around when you can do it with a phone. I think Samsung did it with their headset and their handset. They were the first ones really to pair the two together. I think that's really essential. The use cases are really interesting, actually. The fitness, if you're a personal trainer, if you're trying to learn boxing or MMA, is a really good way, and I think that's really taken off from it. If you could see Nick's background, he has one of his VR headsets always in the background, so he lives and breathes the brand. I think there's another couple of things that have sort of sprung up more recently, just to give some context. Like, this is more of a layman's way of explaining it, but art and visual art and NFTs are going to come in, and you'll use it as a gallery for NFTs, probably with VR. I think adult entertainment dived into it, aka porn. We have to be careful what we say because we might be filtered by the podcast app systems. And then you've got like conferences, which is probably more of a future case. But there's a lot of conferences that are starting to offer VR and VR experiences, and no doubt will be the future. And a couple of things I've seen is the Army have really invested into it, as have golf and F1. So I think they're like really core use cases for VR. Something you also touched upon is AR, and I'll just give a quick context point. Essentially anything that's got filter on is AR. So like Nick said with Snapchat, obviously Instagram and TikTok have leveraged it. I think Snapchat's still the leading players in AR. And then you could really look back to the Glass, the Google Glass, as a use case that people were doing. So AR is really going to need to have the mobile, a glass element around the eyes to enable it to be something that's going to be taken on to the next level, whether that's work-based or play-based. And just lastly, I think one of the important factors to remember with AR is how often you're probably connected to AR. You're unaware of it because it's become quite commonplace. So AR's likely win out over VR in the short term because people are used to it and they're used to using filters, and we're going to definitely will see that move across. So I think that's the sort of the deep dive dummy, my layman's terms, a way of explaining it. Something I'm going to ask Nick around, because I've obviously only have a limited experience with VR and building into it, is I think something that quite a lot of people talk around is presence and the importance of presence in VR. Do you want to go into it and just sort of explain? Because very quickly, if you've got a VR headset on, it almost has to be perfectly aligned with the eyes because of the way the eyes work. So it has to be aligned with the pupil. So presence is really important because you need to understand where people are near you and by you, and understand how gestures and that work to be more normalised. So I don't know if you want to dive into presence a little bit and explain why that's going to be so important.
Yeah, I think presence is a really good term to pick up on. I think it's something that people are starting to look at quite a lot. I think there's different ways of looking at that term. But yeah, I mean, it's that whole experience around the presence. That's one of the big problems with the tethered headsets. As soon as you knock a cable or feel something or anything like that when you're in VR, it starts to make you aware that the experience you're having, there's things going on outside of that draw your attention away. And I think being inside of these fully immersive experiences is something that we're constantly fighting the battle of the kind of 40-second attention span conditioned by all of our mobile devices. And I think being inside like fully immersive experiences is something that gives us like a real opportunity to be outside and away from the normal levels of kind of digital distraction that we're getting. And yeah, I really think that that's where people will start to enjoy VR experiences, because for me, when you put it on, it's like you got tunnel vision. You can only see one thing. Sometimes a really good thing that we haven't mentioned actually is I got one of the early Oculus headsets, the Oculus Go, which I won't get into it too much, but it's a really basic headset and it's really only good for display. Like, it doesn't copy what you do in the real world inside of the virtual world, so you always have to use a joystick to get a reaction in the virtual world. But one of the things it was good for was watching Netflix. It's got a Netflix app on there. You could put Netflix on the headset. It's like you're at the cinema watching a 160-inch screen. And the best thing about it was, I remember at the time, I think I was ripping through maybe the first series of Stranger Things, and actually it was great because I wasn't distracted like everybody else is, just sitting there on the sofa, half watching something, half playing on my phone, or watching something, phone goes off, and I get distracted again. So there's definitely a lot of that in the VR. I think AR's a little bit different from that, because AR, obviously we have that real world backdrop to everything we do. We're overlaying information. We're seeing things like where Facebook are looking at things. We're seeing things like virtual keyboards. So you would be wearing glasses. You'd be seeing a screen like you're looking at your desktop, and you'd be typing on a board which has no keyboard that you can see. It just learns how you want to type in your unique typing style, learns and adapts to it over time, and the result is that keyboard slowly morphs to you, rather than you having to work within the confines of a keyboard. And you'd be the best at typing on your keyboard. If someone else tried to use it, you wouldn't be able to use it. So, but because you're doing that and you're seeing real world around you, potentially, when these things become a bit more understandable and actually usable in the real world, it's totally different. Again, you're back in reality, which is an environment for me which is now made up of, I've had to turn off my Slack, I've had to turn off everything else, because digital distraction is just so difficult to deal with and so difficult to keep our attention spans. We're craving overstimulation now because that's what our brains have been slowly trained to do through smart devices and everything else. So VR gives us that way of really blocking off that outside world and really having that level of being present in experiences. There's lots of opportunities around what it can do for people, and I think it's a really interesting area that we can explore probably for the whole podcast if we want to. But what are your thoughts on it? I'll get your take and then we can...
I think for presence and for being immersive and all of those different components, I think presence is really important when it comes to VR. I've used it a couple of times. I've experienced it a few times by watching obviously on people on video. I think VR, it's a great thing if you want to be away from everything else. I think because it is so immersive, I think it allows people to be a completely different identity. So you don't have to be you. You could be a persona doing something different. It's great that you don't have to be you. And I think the internet was built on a different layer of identity. I think when it first came out, you could be anyone. I think the second phase was then you could be a handle or a username, at Denhard, for instance. And then Facebook and LinkedIn really push for the real you. I think what VR is going to enable people to do is be the person they want to be in that world that they're in. And I think that's really important for people to understand and embrace, because you don't necessarily have to be you in an entertainment space. In a work present space you do. From the gesturing and the intel that you can get, there's a lot of personalisation you could do, so I think it's great. The other side of it is in and around the virtual worlds is going to be really important. So Roblox is the prime example a lot of people use. So kids are building into it. It's getting huge amounts of investment. They're basically essentially building their version of their world, and kids can build into it and then adults can. I think the lockdown winner of Animal Crossing is a prime example that people forget. Is Animal Crossing, although it's a Switch game, essentially does that, and you're just an avatar. You're just a player in that game. If people can connect those dots together, that would be a really important process for AR or VR or alternative worlds, I think, is how some people might have to understand it. I think identity is the most important part. You talked around gestures earlier, or we did, and I think hand, head and voice is really important, but I think that's where... And then I think there's a couple of good examples more recently around AR. I think D&G, I think it's Charlotte Tilbury and Machine A all had AR boutiques, and they were very specifically built to be immersive and experience based. And then we're seeing more and more pop-up stores. So Burberry are doing it. Louis Vuitton had a great pop-up in Paris. I think Harrods are doing a partnership around AR, so they pop up. And then JW Anderson is also another example in fashion that's trying to bring people towards that world again. So I think it's unusual that fashion brings this level of attention and innovation, but I think we need more and more of that example to highlight how important AR and VR will be.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the things, like, back to presence is, especially with, it's that sense of presence in these social experiences. So when you mentioned Roblox earlier, I think that's kind of how, definitely where Facebook want to play. They want to play in these shared social experiences. For them, that's, they describe as their kind of bread and butter. For Facebook, it's all around social experiences and the being present or having presence when you're not there, being able to connect remotely in these alternate spaces. And I think that's a really good point around how we can get to that environment where it becomes more normalized and people are not only present in experiences they're having, but have presence with other people as they have those experiences. And that's the kind of magic point. And we talk a lot about social VR experiences, and that's definitely something that's coming. Avatars, which you mentioned there, are really, really interesting as well, in terms of, do we all have our own avatar? Does that reflect us as a person, and therefore it's realistic towards what we look like, or is it what we aspire to be? And I think that's where things get super interesting. And I think there's some for me, some pitfalls here, especially around the fact that we all know what a dangerous place the internet can be in terms of safeguarding and catfishing, or like pretending to be who they're not, especially when it comes to things like paedophilia and other kind of dangerous topics which are not great for people's well-being, mental or physical. And that is one of the areas where everything in virtual is quite interesting. Everything in virtual shouldn't be like reality, but the fact that it's called virtual reality, it has that element of people wanting, like, they have a kind of spectrum. So in arts where we work, everybody wants things to be as realistic as possible. We did something in South America recently, and a lot of those galleries see our virtual spaces as a way to experiment, which is great. They're very different, and you have a big spectrum of that. And I think that's the bit that worries me about where this is headed. I went to a conference out in New York a few years ago, and they were talking about avatars and how people might need to create their own avatar and have an authenticity that is their avatar, and that is the real representation of the person. So there's that whole kind of, how do I identify myself as a real person or a real avatar if I am not presenting myself in a real way? How does that manifest, and how does that begin to work, and how does that actually impact me in the real world? So I think it was, I can't remember which film it was now. It was like Minority Report, one of those ones where like people were in pods having these experiences. The guy's on holiday somewhere with a attractive partner and having this great virtual experience, and it gets hoiked out of the pod. And it's almost like that. How's that going to impact people longer term when you start to think about mental health, and that your life outside of virtual may not be as fulfilling as your life inside of virtual? And I think that's a really, really interesting area. And I think we're going to get that crossover between, if we start to do more in the workplace via virtual. So we do have, like a virtual office where we put a headset on to access it, and we work on virtual interfaces, and I can look left and see an avatar of my colleague, look right, see an avatar of my other colleague, and we're present in that location together. And that's a work-based example. Obviously, we're going to cross over into social-based and personal-based examples, and it's going to be interesting how they all start to intersect.
There's like a key area, I think, around identity that I think many people have been doing for years, and they've decided to be different people and be different identities. There's a small percentage of people that are and will always be catfishes, and that's something that everyone's a little bit wary of, whether that's on a dating app, a virtual environment, an augmented world, etc. This is what the world is and how it operates. So I think people will get used to it. If you could choose to be something different, or you could build your avatar. When we say avatar, we don't mean like you have to be a cartoon version of you. You don't have to be the blue thing in the movie. You can be a version of you that you build. So a prime example is you could start off as a certain type of being and then evolve and build, and there'd be skins that you pay for, likely evolve and gamification. But I think that's the important part. Is I think will come down to choice and the social network environment to it. It's a case of trying to understand how we bring people into the social networking space of it first, and how these big companies enable, how a Facebook, how a Microsoft, how an Apple really drive social first, because the adoptions either have to come from chasing the chasm. It's always the early adopters that you build for. Will Apple be able to do it with their AR headset that is the worst kept secret in the world? Is it that Facebook are going to do it based on your Facebook profile, or can you be a different avatar? Can you be a different identity on the VR in gaming, etc.? And I think that's where like something like the Switch has done well, is you can be your me, so you can be your version that you build, or you can be you as the Nintendo version of you. One quick point that you made around the work, enterprise and pro, and the gaming and the social aspect of it of VR. Facebook are already doing it in Office, so they already have this built in. VR is already part of it, and they're having to use it to build presence and build it as a muscle memory for people. Until it's in really big companies or really innovative companies, I'd be surprised that Pro will be something that isn't rolled out quickly enough for it to make a mark. So, for instance, Facebook said it's a 10-year plan for VR. They're 5 years in. So can they do something in the next 12 months to make that a reality? Facebook and Google are doing some interesting things. Google released this week their 3D rendering or virtual version of you that you can have almost like seamless conversations as if you're in the same room without having to have a headset. We're seeing different approaches. My point here is, all these big companies, so is it a Samsung versus Apple, or is it a Microsoft versus an Apple versus a Facebook? What is who's going to be the leading brand or the leading company to take VR mainstream or make AR an everyday occurrence in and outside of work?
Well, I think, there's a few points in there to pick up on. I think there's Apple entering, we've all seen, the patent submissions over time for Apple AR products or VR products, whatever speculation you want to believe. I think that Apple are aware that if there is this coming of the need to not have a device in its present form and to have a different style of device, they want to play at that table along with the others. I think that hardware in VR, AR, mixed reality is the kind of key thing, as well as the connectivity. But it's you can see why Apple want to get involved. Microsoft have made a go at it. The mixed reality headset hasn't been too bad, but it hasn't had the kind of widespread adoption. Oculus have the consumer in the palm of their hand via Facebook and Instagram. They can market to them easily. They can appeal to younger audiences. They got a price point that works, and I think it's really about this shift to there's gaming, and if the price point of Oculus Quest is so it can compete with consoles, that's kind of where it's competing in terms of like for like at the moment. It's like I can get games on my VR headset. Sony PlayStation VR got a headset as well, and these more immersive games where you feel like you're there, you suspend belief that in the reality that exists outside of the game that you're immersed in. It's why that being present and that presence and having the responses, the psychological responses to what's happening in front of you in that virtual environment is so important. Facebook and Oculus are putting a lot of investment into this, and they're starting to make some good inroads, especially when it comes to productivity. And I think that is something that's growing. I think remote fitness has grown and shifted in their favour. There's things like the adoption of face masks to stop COVID, which is also working in their favour in terms of people are less likely to bulk at wearing something on their face because we're just more normalised to that now due to COVID. And there's a lot of movement in there, and it is going to become that kind of race. I mean, HTC have more gone down the enterprise route, and I think the race they'll cross over again when Oculus has productivity tools that bring in mobile style interfaces or computer based interfaces, and you're actually doing work. Apple are trying to play in that zone as well, and then you've got HTC who have got a kind of enterprise led solution from the beginning. That are going to offer things there. So you can definitely see where hardware and really the interfaces are going to play their part. I think what Facebook have done, which is smart, and we can post this video in the show notes, is they're looking at like the neural networks in your body and how your brain sends signals down to make, if I want to type, my brain sending that signal to type. Now they've gone down the route of saying, well, what's natural here to intercept those messages so we can use them on these virtual interfaces, and that's using almost like a device that sits on your wrist, because people are used to wearing watches, and it's the perfect place to start to pick up some of those neural signals. It's really, really clever when you think about it, because it's building into existing habits something that feels quite natural, something that works well. And I think what's going to be interesting to see is, you might have a device on your face, and if you're wearing it for long periods of time, you're going to want it to be lightweight and small and more like glasses than a big headset. I think big headsets, after you've worn them for a couple of hours, you want to take them off. They're either too heavy, not well balanced, or a little bit uncomfortable and just not practical. If you need to go to the toilet, you need to take your headset off, move away, and So there's a level of practicality there. I think when we start to talk about these devices that are more like glasses, it's how are they powered? Are they still powered by your smartphone? Is it tethered to your smartphone and you're getting through there? Does it have enough built into it to mean it can operate fully standalone? Is it tethered to the device on your wrist? Like, how's that interaction and interconnectivity going to work? Because I think that's the key for it all. And 5G and 6G is going to definitely help with some of that heavy lifting, being able for it to be able to be done elsewhere, but you're still going to need some level of device on your person anyway. So I just think that it's a really, really interesting space that they're all starting to emerge and play in. What Facebook are trying to do is take the lead, and they're trying to be quite vocal, and that's with Zuckerberg coming out more recently and talking about it more. You can see how big a play it is, and when you're starting to layer potentially the devices, and Facebook's playing to hardware with their ability to create social experiences, that's really, really interesting, and definitely an interesting place for development.
That's like a great segue into, I think this might be the best place to go into the future state of AR, VR, XR, etc. It's probably good for a layman to go first, and then for the expert to go second. If we were to break it down, VR is on version 3, let's call it 3.0. We had it in the sort of the 80s and 90s. We had it in and around into the 2000s, and again now. I think it's stagnated every time. So it's had another life. I think it needs something quite quickly. VR needs a lifeline, in my opinion, but I think that might come from the art world, and I think it might come from removing down the chunkier headset into thinner. The reason why it is so chunky is the lenses that they have to create for it. I personally think there's going to be a number of tech brands that go into mixed first to try and understand if it's worth their investment or not. There's going to be two battles. I think there's going to be the tech battles between Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, plus the others, and then I think sort of the more Western American brands, and I think then there's going to be the Asian brands that come through. It'll split down into AR, VR, and then mixed. I think for the workspace, that might be the time where you see big brands invest into it, and then small brands look up to them and try it. So professional versions or enterprise might be the way to hit masses, but it's a huge investment that has to be made. I can see it working very specifically in certain companies where they invest in it and it coincides with successive products. That's really important. I think Facebook are so invested into the social aspect of it and to make it as cheap as possible, that I think people will that they'll dive into the social space and the gaming space, but I think they might struggle with the workspace. It's expensive enough to stay. It's counterintuitive to what most people say in business, but you can't be cheap enough for anyone to buy it. You have to be expensive enough to have a core group of users to drive the price down. So I think it's expensive enough to stay, and then there'll be skins, etc., that you're buying in play, as it were, as I call it. Something we didn't dive into, which it might probably need its own pod, is the Metaverse. I think the Metaverse angle of it needs VR. If you need an example, it's the Fortnite live events. And I think that's the metaverse is going to be. It's going to be so important for adoption, but also for VR. I could see a gaming company provide enough investment to make the metaverse work. So I think the gaming companies have to go huge into it to make it work. There's loads of people that you could follow around it. Matthew Ball is a great person to follow on Twitter and read some of his deep dives into it. And I think there's something different, just lastly from my end, I think there's something different to come. Mixed reality has loads of different better use cases than VR. But I think AR is the way for us to get closer to a mixed reality, and something that's going to be more used to in business and for play. I think AR is always going to be ahead of VR because of its common use case. Whether companies will want to cross over and do both, I think Facebook's primed for it, but maybe Apple, in the way that they're challenging themselves to be different, might be the way to do it. Nick, what's your future state of reality?
All good points there, and a lot to think about. I think that metaverse is definitely an area where, we need to focus probably a bit more time and attention. But, the future state for me of VR and AR, I think there's going to be a little bit of a shift to more personalization. So a little bit like in nutrition, we're seeing a shift to personalized nutrition. We're going to start to see a shift more towards personalized computing, where the experience is designed around the user. And I think with the use of interfaces, that makes this easier because they're all virtual. You're not reliant, like the keyboard example I gave earlier. The experiences around that person, it makes it more intuitive to access information. You're not reliant on more rigid mobile or physical devices. And you can start to design what works for you, especially with gesture controls, your body, when you're layering on fitness and health information. I think that general kind of fully connected view of what can be achieved with VR and AR is really, really interesting and will capture people's attention. I think on the back of that, we've spoken about big data in enterprise for a lot of time, but I think big data is now emerging within ourselves. It's been here for a while, in terms of how our data is mined and how we're targeted with ads. But I think actually connected devices, plus now we're layering on VR and AR, I think, our data is becoming more valuable all of the time. And it's going to continue to rise in value, especially as we start to do more in VR and AR, especially when we're combining it with other data points. And I think that's going to be another thing about how we own our data, a little bit like how we own our identities in virtual spaces. I think a rise in VR as a form of escapism is going to be key. I think we're used to being at home a little bit more. I'm sure there's going to be this bounce back of people returning to the physical world. But also, like, the amount of time I find myself, and I'm trying to leave my phone away from me after about 8 o'clock at night and before 8 in the morning, because I just find myself sat on the sofa in this kind of cycle of doom scrolling through something, or just going around the apps again and again and looking for some level of fulfillment because I'm kind of hooked on it, that you can offer through virtual environments more meaningful interactions, especially when you layer on social and that whole idea of presence, and you've got the potential to exist in different ways in different worlds in social experiences. And I think that's an area for big development there. A rise in augmented reality wearables, taking away potentially the need for a smartphone in some capacity. Now, that whether that's how you engage and interact with a smart device, a smartphone, it's probably more likely to be that you'll probably still have it on you. You just won't need to look at it as much. A little bit like Apple Watch started to take away the need of, for quick checks on WhatsApp notification, you don't really need to get your phone out all the time. I think there's going to be something, especially with maybe some glasses, that can take away the focus of your phone. It will replace it with something not too dissimilar, that time away from your smartphone. I think the shift to remote has really opened our attitudes to doing things remotely and not in person. And also, like I mentioned previously, wearing face coverings has almost normalised having different things on your face. And I think that might help the adoption of VR and AR headsets, because we're just a bit more used to it now, and I think that's definitely something that was a problem before. There is a kind of a health aspect to that, and how hygienic it is to share headsets and things. So there's that barrier to get over, but I think ultimately we'll be more open. I never saw myself wearing a face covering previously. And then I think just my last one is VR for entertainment in the real world. The rise of multi-sensory experiences where you can go and enjoy. I've seen a couple of art ones and they are absolutely amazing. When done well, they're incredible, where you've got this mixture of spatial audio, you've got incredible visuals, you're teleported to another place. You're not worried about bumping into people because there's ways of not doing that, and having you and friends can go and have the same experience at the same time. And I think once you've done one of these experiences, almost like a theme park kind of analogy, once you've done it once, you'll be open to it again. You're not necessarily going to do them all the time. You're going to pick and choose what you want to do, but I think people will be more open to these public VR experiences, and that will lead to adoption in the home.
Another good schooling on the future state of. That's another good schooling on the future state of. As always, we love your feedback. If you want to subscribe, we're in all the major podcast outlets, and if you want to go to thefuturestate.co.uk, you can get full notes, full insights of what we talk around. So thanks for listening.
Cheers. See you next time.